we have a generation that has not went astray, but was led astray through the systems and the authorities which they were born into. And that generation and generations of people have metastasized their bad habits into larger and larger beasts until there's a question of what is them and what is the bad habit, what is their core self, what is their sense of self, and what is a wound that was inflicted upon them. Because with the infantilization of the human being, there is the personal responsibility to grow past that, to learn, to mature, to upskill, to improve. However, in such a soulless environment that was given to people, how do you expect them to really learn how to inspire themselves? Because if somebody's never tasted victory, or they've never seen what it's like to have an orderly life or something that could be more beneficial to them, how can you judge them for not wanting to build that themselves, or not wanting to provide for themselves an experience that would have all of these virtues and have all these strengths, when part of the issue is that they don't understand the benefits of those already. So when you crush a people and then you find them afraid to go outside, doesn't that kind of make sense that they would feel that way? And how much of it is their responsibility to process that feeling, and how much of it is our responsibility to inspire and motivate them towards better directions? Hello, my fellow schizotypers. Did you hear that noise? And welcome back to another episode of Pilot with Karhlyle Fletcher. I'm your host, Karhlyle Fletcher. Let's get into it, baby. So, one thing that's been on my mind is the tandem issues of voluntary and involuntary infantilization. So, when you're looking at a lot of stats over the decades and comparisons across generations, there's a reversal in a few trends, such as the growth of intelligence. So when you're comparing societies over time, whereas we used to have a tendency to become more literate and more capable over time, we're seeing that people are becoming actually less capable and less active. So you can see this like in terms of raw IQ, which is like, one way to look at things. But then also when you look at people having smaller friend groups, and when you look at people having less sex, people having less like satisfaction, there's larger amounts of depression, all of these things. What I would say is that you're kind of seeing people who aren't really being allowed to live, or aren't really getting the full adult experience. They're being robbed of progression. And maybe not like the standard way doesn't have to be the only way, but it is still certainly a way in which things did make sense. So there's an entire generation, more than that, of people who are getting a worse deal, a worse treatment over time, which is kind of defeating the purpose of having a country or of having a system. So we can see that young people have a worsening fitness, as again, referencing the first episode, obesity is on the rise, and there's these issues with health that are becoming more prevalent over time, not less. And the lack of social bonding, the lack of meeting certain milestones, easy ones that are just like, job satisfaction, having a nice home life, all of those things that just lead to somebody feeling more like an adult or feeling more capable. And then seeing that these people are not getting that part as part of the deal. Part of that, sure, you can be like, oh, they're so lazy. We're going straight up cobblestone. All right, maybe that's not the actual move. We'll do the sidewalk. That would be funny. But yeah, you can't really just make the argument that this is all voluntary, because not all of it is just played out in like, oh wow, people aren't buying a house as much, or like da 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 da. It's like the only way for you to have a lifestyle nowadays requires an income or an investment that is not possible or not realistic for the majority of people with what you could call like a normal or a blue-collar job. So, I mean, that's arguable, but at least the jobs that people are actually getting because of the degree inflation, but they were kind of pressed into the degree inflation. So even that's like arguably voluntary. But I mean, when you look at the way that the environments were built, when you look at places like, I mean, we are here in Grand Rapids, Michigan's second city, and you can see that the downtown is almost completely like dominated by this sprawling single-family zoning. We are literally minutes away from downtown, and already I can see in the same shot like these single-family dwellings and then these massive buildings in the background. And I mean, when you're looking at over the Rhine in Cincinnati, when you're looking at Milwaukee, when you're looking at these cities that are like very densely built urban areas meant to have service to the financial district, and then also some level of ability to, you know, get like there's dense livability, there's businesses, and there's like all the amenities of a local neighborhood. However, there's also access to the financial district. Yeah, I mean, like that's how things used to be built. That's what we used to have as an option. But now it's just like single family homes are just fucking a small apartment, a studio apartment for you. So, I mean, when you look at what other generations used to be able to get, they used to be able to get like these usable systems, usable products, usable living spaces that meant for a dignified and capable life, where it's like you could have a hobby car in your garage, you could have a spare room as a study, you could convert, like, you know, if you had a stay-at-home wife and you had a large enough house, you could start doing a daycare business out of that. There's just like more options when you have more things. However, that doesn't really undo entirely the generational responsibility to improve upon certain things, like the DoorDash and the reluctancy to learn how to take care of a house, like on basic skills, is like a failure of the education system, but also a failure of the individual to accept being infantilized and accept being somebody who's just ultimately incapable. And that resiliency to maturation, that resiliency to growth is just self-defeating in a way that there are other efforts that one can make. There's like, you know, yes, sure, there's being hurt, but then there's also healing. That's also an option of what you can do. So then there's also the issues of like Tinder and like of these social media marketplaces that replace basic human functionality, or replace basic human responsibility, where it's like you no longer need to vet people through your friend group. You can just go fuck a stranger and then like expect that to have the same success rate and the same value as more tried and true methods. So it's just it seems to be a little bit of a confused way of seeking out what people have always been able to figure out how to get, which is that people want sex, people want friends, people want work, all of these things. But like when you have the inability to see the interrelation of like all of these things, where it's like, you know, yeah, sure, you can get into like fucking mathematical understandings of like people only want people who are this level of success and things, but even like being somebody who's like, oh yeah, dude, like I'm a fucking, you know, boat builder, it's like interesting because it's like, oh, okay, do you like that job? And it's like, well, yeah, dude, I've been doing it for like 30 years. Like that gives you a sense of belonging to the larger world around you, because why are you making boats? People need boats, your city probably needs boats, you know, so it's like the reason why you're doing this is to be somebody who's a functionary or like, you know, a contributor to the larger picture. So that's why it gives you access to friends. That's why it gives you access to relationship things and like all of that, is because then you're just a part of a social fabric. Meanwhile, it's like if you just have like a desk job that you hate for a company you don't give a fuck about, and then like you're not hitting the bars, you're not like walking your dog in the park, you're not like in a situation in which like you're growing your social circle, then like yeah, isolation is just what occurs. And then like isolation is linked to like brain degradation and like, you know, the rise of like dementia and like things like that. So it's like further an issue of like this recursive issue of the built environment promoting isolation and promoting like a lifestyle that is very broken apart and made into these little atomized communities. And then when you're comparing that, or when you're taking that into account, and then you're seeing that the individual damage of people, again, going with Tinder and the fast food of relationships rather than like, you know, engaging in their local poetry community, or like joining a fencing club, or like, you know, working on their hobby car, or something that is just going to build human connection over a shared goal or like a shared interest that will at least give them like a fallback, where it's like, you know, if you get really depressed, you can like fuck up your whole life by just like losing interest in the things that you want. So like if you lose interest in the things that you want to do or that you want to be part of your life, and then like you're just floundering because like, you know, you don't have the energy or the ability to just recommit to them, then like that can really fall out of your life. Meanwhile, if you're part of a community or a larger whole that shares those values and shares that interest, and like even when you're like returning after a depression, there's going to be people there who are like, you know, hey man, I got you, everything's going to be fine. You know, so, or it's not even like, hey man, I got you, everything's gonna be fine. It's just gonna be like, hey man, like I also share these interests, I also am invested in these things, so like, you know, they just continue doing it when you weren't there, and then like when you show up, they're just still doing it, and then like that gives you the motivation to continue a potential hobby that you could have lost out on simply because like, you know, life sucks, and sometimes like things just aren't going the best. So it's like, this is where I kind of harp on the point of Jesus Christ, this road blows. But also like social resiliency and robust social networks are something that adds to the quality of life and defends from like the issues just eating away at you as you like completely lose your interest in doing anything, you know. So when we look at the built environment of the Americas, we see again like over the Rhine, Milwaukee, like places that are like dense, livable, and like if you can buy into that, then you're buying into a permanent community, and then you see that immediately be destroyed and paved over by highways, and then from the other side of those highways, the sprawling system of suburbs that never quite achieve the same zoning or the same density. So look at the aesthetics of the built environment, you look at what the people have had given them, sort of soul simplifications of an urban fabric where a square is simply a piece of concrete rather than something encapsulated or enmeshed. It's silly to say, and it's something that's comical, but the difference between phallic and womb architecture is one is imposing and one is enclosing. And there is a question on how much of this dumbing down of the human being, how much of this simplification is by choice and how much of it is by design. And that's the thing about being an intelligence agent, is that you don't have to be aware or cognizant that you are. You don't have to be aware that you're contributing to the conspiracy. You don't have to even know what the conspiracy is, but you just need to be useful to it. You need to be a part of it through your actions, and the less aware you are, actually, the better. So there's the question of, is it design? Is it neglect? Is it people who don't know better? Who's the victims? Is everybody a victim? Is it not their responsibility to fight back? Is it not our responsibility to claw meaning back from life from the face of a mediocre and endlessly bureaucratic abyss? You can apply to something. You can do all of those things, but what is it when you really want some sort of support in the ways that it's like, if you are not enabled to take risk, how do you learn how to take risk without a support structure? And can we expect the human being to do that realistically? Is a question that I have for this. Because again, with the concepts of voluntary and involuntary infantilization, we're arriving at a people who have ultimately been declawed and neutered. And that question is, how much of your responsibility or how much of their responsibility is it to reclaw themselves and to find that meaning? And is it possible in such a soulless structure? However, they find similar issues in West Germany versus East Germany, so it does imply that even with a beautiful architecture, even with a beautiful environment, the very society itself is boiled down to very narcissistic and infantile reality. So when this is the city that has resisted the highway's destructive path, there's a question of what sort of society and what sort of community building is really possible in just sort of many featureless rectangles that are meant to be office buildings and state buildings and theaters. And it's the commodification of the urban fabric to a point where how does one make it into a home? How does one make it into a real community when the obvious purpose is for transportation, is for the bragging about material wealth and the showing of ostentatious objects? Like, everything here is a vanity project, whether that's the car that people are driving or these new builds that are meant to be so forward thinking or some sort of revolution by saying like less is more and things like that. But eventually what happens when people are sick and tired of less? What happens when people feel just like ants and just feel like no matter how much effort they put in and no matter how many changes they make, they still don't feel like they are in a position to actually have power over their future or over their fate? And there is a certain dignity that should be reflected in the built environment, but instead you have what was once beautiful paved over with featureless buildings, and then you wonder why people are so desperate to be outside and why people are obsessed with hiking and biking, and that's like how they end up being social and running into one another. But there's nothing to do here, there's nowhere to be here. There isn't like a community that, you know, started communist China. There isn't a community that started an artistic movement. There's just profit. There's just profit, corporate entities, governmental entities, all these things that are so much larger than life, which is reflected in the art, reflected in the abstract, featureless art, for the abstract, featureless buildings that remind you of what legacy? The legacy of saving money and cutting corners so that the corporations don't actually have to pay for something that is of high value for the people who have to use it every day. Because the people who are getting fucked by that are the artisans and the craftsmen who were actually the people who were capable of building these things before we replaced them with the factory that had the lowest costing product. And the people who have to use and inhabit these spaces, because instead of having something that reminds them of the dignity of life and the power that is pro-social spaces and the humans coming together to try to make something larger, instead it's just like this featureless reminder that you're nothing and that you can be replaced and that all of your efforts would be in vain. And then how you expect people to just rise above that when they're driving 40 minutes from a single family home in an isolated community without solid places to socialize into an environment like this, which just states that you're empty. You can go to a school to try to, upskill and be more valuable, or you can sell whatever value you have in these sorts of buildings. But what are you from? Who are you? What are you doing? It's Anywhere USA. And that's where it's like, you know, the streetcar lines actually do differentiate themselves. Wealthy Street does feel like it has a character. The Crescent neighborhood does feel like it has a character. But this could be fucking anything that I'm standing in. And that's the environment that gets copied and pasted throughout the United States of this. You might be nothing. So if we keep telling the kids you might be nothing and you might not be worth anything, and there's no religion, there's no self-help, there's none of this stuff that's actually like pushing people to improve, then kind of no shit that they're not taking these risks and they're not going out there. Because yeah, everything's owned by fucking the same conservative families in the city. But what are these postmodern schlocks of buildings, you know? You can see like this is the DeVos place. This was built as a monument to somebody who was in Trump's cabinet, you know? This is what they've given you. So even the conservatives can't give a fuck about traditional beauty. Like, what does that say? It says that even the people who you would expect to have some sort of understanding that there are traditional buildings here, and there is like a real vernacular style, but just fuck it, dude. Glass and steel and New York architects, baby. That's all that we fucking need. How do we make everything feel like a hellish cross between Detroit, LA, and fucking, yeah. It is just depressing, man. We're trying to figure it out, but that is where, what is the line here between what people should be doing to contribute to their own future and what the environment should be doing to contribute to them. John F. K. was a fucking idiot for that one, because your country needs to do something, or else it is just a place you pay rent. And with excellent guides and excellent examples of beautiful buildings and a beautiful tradition of building, there is an obvious choice and a preference towards buildings that are cheaper and less filled with character, as things like this and streets like this are destroyed or were destroyed in urban renewal for highways, and instead it's been replaced by parking lots, single-family homes, and corporate offices. And it shows a preference by design, instead of for strong urban communities and personal engagement in the civic environment. Instead, a preference for isolated and disparate people who have to rely on a sort of faux self-reliance rather than building a larger whole. That's just where it's like the built environment makes you this isolated lifestyle that's almost impossible to escape from, which seems to be by design. It doesn't seem like to be an accident that everybody feels the same miserable way. So yeah, I've been literally looking at downtown this entire conversation, this entire ride, and like it's just that this shit is now it's like that's gonna be, so there's mixed use zoning coming in there that's very good. We don't need to get distracted with the top of Grand Rapids, but this is a map of it. So, you know, there were, on all these main streets, there were businesses and things like that. Like we're on Plainfield now, which is a main street that goes into the downtown cycle. And then there was Fulton and Wealthy, and Cherry, and all of these things that were built as streetcar suburbs that were directly related, were directly interconnected through rail to the downtown core. And then when they didn't receive funding from the city, everything got shut down. So, oh fuck. When the Grand Rapids didn't finance their streetcar system, and so then because of that the streetcar died off and it was replaced by the bus system, which is, you know, fine. That it does provide public transit, and it is like the best in the region of West Michigan. Maybe arguable, but it's one of the better ones compared to the fucking sticks. So there is infrastructure here. The buses are good for that. That is like a benefit, but that's where it's in part due to the environment, in part due to the structures that we provided, that people live these lifestyles. But, you know, it's like when you're not engaging in a robust social network, then everything relies on something else. So you're not just going to, you know, you're not if you have your girlfriend's friends and then you guys break up, you're fucked. If you have friends through school and then you stop attending to that school, you get fucked. If you're in a position where all of your friends are work friends and you lose that job, you're fucked. And that's where the robustness of a social network really defines the health of the individual, where you can have like 3 critical life events and lose your entire social network, like your entire people. And like that is something that is no bueno. It's not something that should be allowed, you know. But I mean, it's the fucking everyday reality of the people who live in this country. And like the fact about that is that oh boy. The fact about that this is a lot of people's everyday reality means that it's something that we have to prepare for, is that you get these people who just directly fall straight through the system. And like that's what I would wager a lot of homelessness is due to, is that there's not a robust social network, so there's not options for people to socialize, to find meaningful work, meaningful like place, like community, people marry, like all these things. I think that it's not that this, you know, like part of this is that if you fuck up at all, you get fucked entirely, which doesn't seem like to be the wisest or the healthiest way to plan a system. So yeah, part of that is due to individuals using like Tinder to not deal with having to get a larger social group. But like part of it is also the fact that we've built it in such a way that you're not going to know all of your neighbors. You're not going to, I mean, people stopped going to church, people stopped going to these communities that really, like, you know, made for a more meaningful or larger whole. So we end up with cheaply fabricated buildings and a community of people who rely on frivolous art and self-expression rather than any real engagement with the world around them. This parasitical attitude of everybody being a main character in this isolated bug world where only their feelings are real and only they've suffered. Like all that sort of narrative building is a reflection of the hollowing out of our environment, which is why there's this perpetual attitude of the self, and the worship of the self is the true measure of the world, of everything, where unless the individual expresses it, unless the individual feels it, it has no relevance and no value. So that's where the question is it the built environment and is it the people? And when you see millions and millions of people fall into this trap, into this attitude of I'm the only person whose time matters, I'm the only person whose feelings matter, I'm the only person who gets to really feel things. That's when you're looking at a environment in which everybody is stuck themselves in a very negative cycle of not being able to address their issues honestly and to be able to then create growth because of this perpetual happened to me attitude. But with the inability for people to accept responsibility and without the ability to self-reflect and look into the self, all you've ended up with are a group of people who are hungry to express themselves, or hungry to defend themselves, who are quick to just be like my feelings, but are never able to really engage with the community and the world around them. So I would say that's a reflection of the built environment, but it's also a damning proof that the human condition is one of selfishness and of self-interest primarily. Where before people had a pressure to have to work together and develop empathy and develop these social skills that actually went beyond the individual, nowadays it's much more advantageous to only give a fuck about yourself, to only argue for yourself, to only stand up for yourself. And like that's like just the rise of narcissism, the rise of ethno-narcissism, the rise of this inner narrative of just not only victimhood, but being the center of the universe. All of these things seem to be converging into a truly just dead in the water population of people who refuse to grow. And so, as always, for people who are seeking radical comfort, the only thing that is the solution would be radical discomfort. And to truly challenge these people and to break them down and to show that no, you are not the only measure of reality, you're not the only measure of the world around you, and that your actions can actually directly impact the quality of your own life. So, yeah, we have to question, how much does the built environment dictate lived experience? And that's basically the crux of the issue, because then the built environment causes like all these isolatory issues that people are no longer capable of bridging these gaps. But then like people are, instead of challenging themselves and breaking out these cycles and making it make do no matter what's wrong, they're instead seeing a rise in narcissism and seeing a rise in autism and seeing a rise in BPD and like all these issues that are coming out in people, rather than like, you know, a healing attitude of the ability to master yourself, master your life, and just ensure a better outcome. Because there is seeing your wounds, and there is caring about how you're being treated, and like if this is right, like all of these things. There is the, you know, temptation or the like, you know, human instinct to scratch that urge of being like, well, this shouldn't happen to me and I deserve better than this. But like, it's being activated in such a way in response to isolation and difficulty and like this pain, that it's creating a system of just like self-fulfilling prophecies in which like these people are fucked over from the beginning, and like they're getting a pretty bad luck at the draw in terms of like human quality of life and socialization and health and fitness and like all of that. And then in response to that bad draw, they're just like further enabling the terrible infrastructure and the terrible like situation that they're in by refusing to work on something better or build a better reality by sacrifice, by seeing, hey man, like I'm not so special, things happen to me because bad things happen to everybody, and then like how can I overpower these bad things, how can I make it so that they don't affect me in ways that I don't want to see. And now we're in the downtown, so again, like this is the core, but like miles, there's 3 miles of this style of building, and then there's like I think 22 miles. We're gonna have to check that number, but you know, like there's like of sprawl, so it's like pretty sure it's a 9 ratio or an 8 ratio. It's between those two of just like suburban sprawl compared to the dense urban environment. But environments like this sort of encourage people to find what they're doing, what they want. Where it's like you have all of these services that are directly related to a larger public and a larger group of people that translates to, again, a civitas or a community or whatever the fuck you want to call it, that lends itself to people wanting to interact with one another, wanting to pair off and form relationships, wanting to start like soccer clubs and all that bullshit. And, like, that's where areas like this thrive, and by having density and things like that, you can drive the price down and create something more stabilized. Whereas like with the current built environment, isolation is king, and it's compared to the current built environment where isolation is king and there's limitless ways to be left behind, and be turned into a social just like outcast by like poor decision making on like just, hey, I think I'm going to work remotely, and also I'm going to save money, so I'm not going to do any of my hobbies. It's like, okay, that like sounds like a reasonable thing until you end up entirely just out without like anybody that you can contact, because like thousands of people now, millions of people now are like, I don't have a single person in my life that I would consider a close friend or someone I can trust. So the effort that it is like, you know, so now that, oh fuck, so loud. But now that we've laid out, you know, essentially large parts of the argument, large swaths of the argument, the question, or not the question, so now that we've laid out large parts of the argument, there's the personal experience of being like, you know, how do I find friends? And it's like, well, yeah, it's difficult, but then it's like engaging in hobbies and like being outside and showing the willingness is one of the easiest ways to end up just being connected to people outside of yourself with a larger interest and talent pool than you have yourself. And I don't, like, yeah, sure, everybody has hobbies and everybody has interests, but you'll find that not everybody is willing to be open to new people or be open to just putting in continual effort over time to be connected, you know, like to have an experience of life and all of that where they don't have to be alone. And I don't know, there's just this tendency of people to fall into those isolatory habits and then just settle with deteriorating social fabrics and less social ability, which tends to correlate to less social interaction, which tends to correlate with less cognitive ability and dementia, psychosis, and all these things as people grow older. So it's like, yeah, sure, joining a dance group might not, like, you know, immediately save your life, but in the long term, if you really fucking love dancing or you really fucking love any sort of activity, engaging up with other people to do it is not only going to be a way for you to become better at said activity and like to be able to engage in it more, but it also gives you, you know, further access to larger social networks, which then, you know, whatever you need, maybe a job, maybe whatever, and like that's just the traditional way of getting access to these things and getting like the ability to finally, you know, or not finally, but to build resilient social networks in which nothing depends on a specific thing, or like, you know, you just get, essentially it's like the nepotism of locality, or the nepotism of being a social animal. Just that the reward for being around, just that people will remember you and include you in things. Because again, like for me, it's like, you know, you roll up to a bike group, you like fucking talk to some people who play music, you like just show up to a cafe enough times, the people will remember you and they'll want to engage with you, because that's, again, we're a social animal. It's not really that complicated. You just see people and you're like, oh, I have these shared memories, we should either engage in those shared memories or like, you know, reflect on them and see, is this person somebody who I highly like or somebody who maybe not be the best for me, you know? So through my own experiences in life, I can tell you the more that I've just put in the effort to do the legwork of like, how do you get to know people and all that shit, and did it through my own interest on my own terms. The more that I've engaged with other people on my own interest, on my own terms, the more robust that's become. The easier it's been to find, you know, people to do whatever you want, rather than just like relying on this or that certain like experience in life or certain like situation you're in. It's just, okay, I'm gonna go out there, I'm gonna find people who have shared interests, I'm gonna spend time with them doing other things, which is like, you know, but it's just like with work, family, and school, or with work, fucking family, friends, all that. It's like all these things are just so fragile. It's like you're never going to be able to really invest in the same security of being as you would just being like a useful part of a larger whole, or like, yeah, sure, a cog in a machine, but you know, the machine needs the fucking cogs. So it's like, if you make yourself useful or a part of something larger than yourself, then people will naturally seek out your contribution and your space to be there, because people don't like it when people get left behind. So that's just, all of these things can be in part resolved by refusing to be left behind and putting in the effort to keep up. Like, there's no way that people aren't going to reach back and be like, hey dude, like, that's really, like, I'm glad that you do that, I'm glad that you reach out to the larger community, and I want you to still be a part of it. And it's like, hey man, I've tried that fucking once, and then like people didn't immediately start like sucking my dick. And it's like, no dude, it's not like you show up once and people just start bending backwards to fucking, like, you know, give you what you want. It's that you show up and continually, and like you do that with enough communities, and then some of them just become like really important to you. It's like, I would challenge you to repeat doing this, like, you know, thousands of times, and then come back and say like, oh yeah, now that fucking mattered to me. I think it's like near impossible to just be like, oh yes, I've like joined all these communities and they don't mean anything to me. Like, that's fucking inhuman. So yeah, we're at the beach. Go buy your beats.